All right, welcome. My name is Christian Martinson. I'm here at the Moody Distance Learning Center on the campus of Moody Bible Institute in downtown Chicago. I have with me here today Dr. James Spencer, who is the Assistant Dean of Online and Non-Traditional Education here at Distance Learning. Hello, James.
Hello.
And we are doing our first kind of online Moody Academy style in honor of the Khan Academy, where we're utilizing some of this software to do some live mini lectures, and we'll post these on online for you as an audience to use as you wish, and we will likely be utilizing these in some courses. So what we want to talk about today is we're going to start with some kind of broad strokes on the Old Testament. We're going to focus on the Pentateuch, and in particular reading the Pentateuch, yeah, James?
Yeah, developing really a reading strategy for the Pentateuch. I think everybody kind of understands the Pentateuch are the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And when you think about the Pentateuch, I think a lot of times you think about creation or maybe Exodus. And, obviously the whole Bible starts with "in the beginning." But what people often forget is that the Pentateuch is really written from the perspective of Deuteronomy. And people.
Why don't you write Deuteronomy on there? That'll be our first little
Sounds
doodle,
good.
so people know that this thing actually works. It will eventually. We're going to get better as these things go, but people seem to appreciate our mistakes because, believe it or not, Dr. Spencer's human.
That's right. So Deuteronomy is the last in the 5 books of the Pentateuch.
It is.
And Deuteronomy, you have a people who are standing at the cusp of the Promised Land, waiting to go in. Moses is not going to be allowed to enter with them, and so you have this tension, but also some anticipation of them going in, and that actually happens in the book of Joshua. But the Pentateuch is really structured: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, from the perspective of these people who are going to enter the land.
Now, not to interrupt, James, but how do you think the typical Bible reader, Christian Bible reader, would approach when they just start in Genesis? How do you think their mindset is a little bit maybe skewed, if you will, when they're looking at the text?
Well, for good reasons and bad reasons. I think that the whole creation evolution debate has really begun to frame the way that people read the Pentateuch. And so when you get into creation, the very first chapter of Genesis, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and he did that in 7 days. Then the next logical question that people usually ask is, well, were those a literal 7 days or a figurative 7 days?
Yeah.
Are we talking early Earth or late Earth? And what about Darwin? Those are great questions, but when you're reading the Pentateuch, it's also good to focus on what the message is, how the creation narrative is actually functioning in Genesis through Deuteronomy.
Sure.
And so I think that people really start squarely at the beginning, but they also start with those questions in mind a lot of times.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And I think it's better to actually start reading with Deuteronomy in mind, understanding that the Pentateuch is really a narrative of national formation, of how Israel became Israel, and how it started out on its quest to get into the Promised Land. And so as I think through just a real easy reading strategy of how to begin thinking through the Pentateuch, number one I would say is think about this diagram. This is a fairly common ancient Near Eastern kind of diagram. The ancient Near East is really where Israel lives. You have Abraham being called out of Mesopotamia. Egypt would have been in that mix. But the ancient Near East was broadly the culture that Israel grew up in.
Right, yeah.
And so in the ancient Near East, often the way they thought about their relationship with God, or the gods, in many nations' case, was that you had a threefold relationship between God, people or nation, and often the king was in there as well, and then land, or blessing and abundance. And the idea was, particularly in nations outside of ancient Israel, that if you had a strong relationship with God, you're going to be happy as a people and have abundance in the land.
So you're saying this concept was something common not just in Israel but outside of Israel in that time?
Correct.
Okay.
And you can see it in the Pentateuch as well. God's original call to mankind is to go forth, multiply, subdue the earth. And so you see the people growing, you see the nation growing. You also have the promises of God to Abraham that he'll possess land.
Yeah.
And so all these fit within this broad picture, but the only thing I would say is that it's not a rigid picture.
Sure.
It's not a formula where people can relate to God and get stuff.
Sure.
But it is a fairly easy grid to look through. And actually, if you read the narratives of Genesis through this grid, they make a lot more sense.
Yeah, no, I'm sure they do.
Many of the Genesis narratives are either about people getting people, particularly in the Abraham-Sarah narratives, where Sarah can't have children,
right,
and ultimately they go through Ishmael and Isaac,
yeah,
or getting land.
Sure.
And so you have Abraham buying the cave of Machpelah from the Hittites, or even the sojourns into Egypt become sort of a scary thing for the Israelites.
That makes sense. Yeah.
In broad strokes, though, in reading the Pentateuch, you really do see this at the end of Deuteronomy. Here you have a people who have multiplied. They've come out of Egypt. They're a large, massive people. They've had some trouble in the wilderness throughout Numbers. They've been given the law in Leviticus, and now they're standing on the cusp of land.
Yeah.
And the choice that they're given are: do you obey God and get the land and the abundance and the blessing, or do you disobey God and get the curses and the death and the bad things? And that's a choice that's given throughout Israel's generations. The implication is that this is really what Israel is all about. Are they going to fulfill the original destiny they got at creation, which was also human destiny, which was to fill the earth and subdue it, and Israel sort of begins as a paradigm within the land?
Yeah.
Or are they going to, like Adam and Eve before them, rebel, reject God's law, and lose out on the blessing?
And so that's essentially the type of audience that's helpful for us to understand is receiving the Pentateuch, essentially, from Genesis through Deuteronomy. That's the kind of the mindset we need to understand they're working from here.
Correct. Yeah. And so I would encourage you, as you actually think through reading the Pentateuch, read through the Pentateuch once, all the way through, and then think through themes like creation and how it works with land. Think about creation and how it works with ideas of order. In what way does God's created order stand in juxtaposition to, let's say, the way that Pharaoh ruled Egypt when the Israelites were slaves there?
Sure.
Creation ends with Sabbath and rest, and there's this day where everybody can refresh and worship. Pharaoh, number one, he tries to oppose the destiny of humankind by killing the Israelites, curtailing their numerical growth. But he also denies them the ability to go out and worship the Lord. Sure. And so under Pharaoh, there is no rest, there is no worship, and there is no fulfillment of destiny. And so you have these sort of themes that kind of carry over, and you see them folding throughout the Pentateuch. So creation is one, seed is another. Really in Genesis through Deuteronomy, but primarily in Genesis, you see the beginning of this messianic expectation. It's actually, you find it in a very small kernel when God says that the woman's seed will crush the seed of the serpent. Many take that as a messianic prophecy. I think that's a very veiled messianic prophecy that in hindsight we see as messianic. You also have the reference in the blessings that Jacob gives his sons. In chapters 49 and thereabouts at the end of Genesis. And so there are some other scattered messianic references, but primarily those would be the ones. And then I think it's always important as you read through the Pentateuch to realize that this is all about God. These other themes are great to think about. They're interesting to think about, and I actually spent a lot of time studying creation. But in studying creation, what I always try to do is root this back into who God is. And so I would suggest that when you read through the Pentateuch, you're always thinking about writing a God who statement. In other words, if I think through creation, I think of, something like this. That God who orders.
Just so our audience understands, we are in downtown Chicago. If you hear the L train in the background, I hope that doesn't bother you. You're just going to have to take the surroundings here of the city with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
Maybe it adds a little bit to the dynamic.
It's a little
and the
ambiance.
Excitement. Yeah, ambiance. Some urban dynamic.
That's right.
Yeah. So the God who orders.
Absolutely. And I think that characterizes a good bit of the creation narrative. You know, you could also do the God who blesses with children. You know, the God who empowers humans to fulfill their destiny.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think it's important to root that back in who God is.
Sure. We had an interesting conversation not too long ago where you had brought up the point where most people bring their preconceptions of God into how they read, not just maybe the Pentateuch, but how they read all of Scripture. And I think you asked me the question, if you were going to have a standard view of who you say God is, and if you would ask someone and they say, well, God is love, well, that conviction is going to influence the way they read all of Scripture. If you ask someone else and they think of God as angry, that also will influence everything else. So if you were going to kind of address that concept into what you're talking about here, how would you encourage people to essentially view God initially as they start to approach that idea?
I think the nice part about this is by constructing the God who statements, you begin to sort of explode those presuppositions.
Yeah.
So when I approach the text of Scripture, a lot of times I'm thinking God is free.
Mm-hmm.
God is outside all human structure.
Yeah.
God has no limitations that I would set on him. Anything that I want to do, he could feel free not to do.
Mm-hmm.
Any boundaries that I think I have, he does not have those same boundaries. And so a lot of times when I approach the text, that's what I'm seeing. But when I read the creation narrative, that's not really present. You know, obviously, you could make inferences there and see it, but really what's emphasized in the creation narrative, for instance, is God's sovereignty, his ability to control all things, and also his wisdom, his ability to order those things in a specific manner and put things in places where they actually will be beneficial to mankind and serve his purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that by following this method and taking, you know, passage by passage, book by book, and saying, okay, how is God truly pictured here?
Mm-hmm.
You begin to lose that sort of, well, God is sovereign, or
Mm-hmm.
you know, God is free, or God is love, and you really begin to see who God is based on these specific books. You know, you get into Numbers, and while definitely God is still a God of grace in the Old Testament, in Numbers you see a God who punishes and who really demands obedience.
Yeah.
I mean, he's not interested in any excuses. He's not interested in all that. He is interested in Israel obeying him, and he's willing to keep them in the desert until they do.
It's not the stuff you want to write children's books on.
Not particularly necessarily.
No.
It might give some nightmares, but you know, it's important for everybody to understand that God has those requirements.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great. So as we wrap this up and move into our next little instructional video, where do you want us to leave off as kind of the core thought as we take this initial thought of reading the Pentateuch?
I would really suggest reading the Pentateuch multiple times.
Yeah.
Getting used to the literature in there and being able to think through it front to back and back to front. Starting to notice those sort of relationships that circle through the book. I think that'll really help you as you think about what it's about. And then also I would really encourage you to leave some of those debates you've heard behind.
Yeah.
Things like the creation-evolution debate, they're great topics, but when you're actually reading the Pentateuch to try to gain its message, the ancient Near Eastern mind probably wasn't thinking about Darwin. That was a little before their time. And so I think
there were a lot of prophetic people back then.
There definitely were. And it's not that I don't think that the creation narrative really addresses that. It's just a different question.
Absolutely. Great. And one other thing you mentioned that I think we'll have another video on here is the literature in the different parts of the Pentateuch that are helpful to understand. So that's it for this video. Hope it was helpful, and we'll see you in the next one.